Hello to everyone watching this recording. Welcome to another episode of Revolutionize STEM Women in STEM webinar series. Today we are speaking with Alana Karen, who is the Director of Search Platforms at Google. She's an advisor of True Diversity, founder of Enrich, and the Emeritus advisor of Build. She authored the critically acclaimed book entitled The Adventures of Women in Tech: How We Got Here and Why We Stay. She is also an alumnus of the University of Virginia.
Hi everyone. Thank you, there are people joining. Hi Alana, it's nice to see you. So welcome everyone to the fourth episode of Revolutionize STEM's webinar series. Today we have Alana Karen, who is an author and director of Google Search. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us, Alana, and would you like to start off by introducing yourself and your profession?
Sure. My name's Alana Karen. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I'm getting nods. My name's Alana Karen, and I work at Google. I've spent about 20 years at Google in various operations and leadership roles. And I'm currently in a leadership role for a program management team. Those are the people who help engineers get their work done, help them set milestones, figure out what's going wrong, all of that fun. And I do that for search infrastructure. So I call that kind of the core of the core. If you wonder how a Google search result page shows up, that's what the team I work with does, and how the results show up on that page. But I've had a lot of different jobs along the way, often on kind of the front lines of how products get supported or how they get installed. So I've been working on ads on Google Fiber, which is our ultra-fast broadband product. So a lot of fun and interesting jobs along the way. And I also wrote a book just in the last year, released it last year, late last year, called The Adventures of Women in Tech: How We Got Here and Why We Stay. So that's my career and me in a short story. I'm sure you're going to ask me more.
So as a woman in tech, what does a day in your life look like?
I don't know if I'm sort of the average woman in tech. For context, I'm now a director of a group of about 70 employees. And then I also have an extended group that I work with. So my day-to-day is a ton of meetings, because I'm coordinating on things that those people are doing. I'm answering questions for them. I'm dealing with projects that might run into difficulties or organizational questions when there's difficulties. So a lot of unblocking or checking in on things, and that's a lot through meetings. I will say that if you're an engineer who's responsible for coding, your day may be the inverse of mine, and meetings may be the exception, and time dedicated at your desk to get work done may be the rule of the game. But for me, it's actually way more people than computers, which I always think is really funny, because I think people picture tech being, very tech. But for me, it's all about the people problems. And, why aren't we aligned? Why aren't we staffed well enough for a project? How do we get more help on this? And so a lot of that is getting sorted out through conversations and just good old people time.
That sounds interesting. So what interested you or inspired you to pursue a field in technology? And did you always know that you wanted to work in this field?
I knew that I was intrigued by early, and just to date me, I was in college in the 90s. And so I knew what I was interested in was early web design. I had actually been kind of like the artsy kid, the drama kid, and I wrote poetry and was getting a liberal arts degree. I was studying history. So there really was nothing where I had grown up and thought, oh, I want to be an engineer. I didn't even know what engineers did, or anything that was more of the historic kinds of technical work, like mechanical engineering or other types of things. That I had been leaning firmly towards humanities and liberal arts. But what was happening right at that time was basically the new world of web design. And I love the fact that I'd grown up around computers. I could type really well. I love the fact that I could connect that part of what I already knew, that I was computer savvy, with this world where you could like instantly make things. And because my interests hadn't been purely artistic, but also about information and how you convey information, it ended up really being an interesting world where I could make web designs for internships that I was doing, and then help them convey their information better. And that just clicked for me. So that was really the seed. When I was graduating, I started to look for jobs, junior jobs in web design or something like that, so I could continue that road. And looking for those kinds of jobs ended up getting me into tech over the years, and actually over time into jobs that had very little to do with that, because I realized along the way that I liked other things more. But that was the spark.
You mentioned growing up like computer savvy. Could you tell us a bit about your educational background and then go into depth about the past tech roles you've had in companies up until this point, I guess?
Sure. I grew up with a dad who was doing early, like his job on a computer, basically, like early studies for pharmaceutical drugs and leveraging early tools for data collection and data synthesis. And I would work with him on the summers, or I would work with him for spare money and do some of the data entry. And over time, some of the other little side jobs that I had a little bit of computer time, or I was doing it either because I was writing poetry or because I liked early games on the computer, whatever it was. But I got to college already being a pretty good typer and already um, interested in computer and like spending time on them. But also what I had been naturally leaning towards in school, what I liked more were things like English and history than math and science. That's just how the cookie had crumbled for me. I will say that I hadn't necessarily been told anything that helped me understand why I might like math or why it might be useful. Like, I remember asking my calculus teacher why we were rotating the parabola, because it seemed like a lot of work and I didn't know why we were doing it. And she didn't say, she just was like, do it. She didn't say, like, hey, when you learn how to do things like this is the precursor to careers in, you know, I insert, like building spaceships or like whatever it is. She didn't give me any kind of context for it. Maybe if they had, and I do think they're starting to do this more, it might have sparked something. But at the time, there wasn't anything. And also, there was nothing, there were no, like, you didn't grow up knowing that people could work in what we think of as like modern day technology jobs. Those were just really starting to happen while I was in college. So if I had gone the traditional route from my college, I would have gone into banking or consulting. That's what got recruited for on my college campus. And so none of that really sparked me. And so I was really studying. I experimented a little bit with other classes, but I really ended up focusing on history, French, some creative writing. Those ended up being kind of the core of what I studied. So I graduated and got my first job as a webmaster at the college where I was graduating from, purely honestly because of the merits of the background I'd built up doing my own work and internship, and the fact that I knew the deans. Like I knew them and had done work for them. And so that's how I ended up talking my way into that job. And I did that for about a year, revamping their website from something that had been built badly over the years into something beautiful that really matched the rest of the university's design, and realized I didn't like the city I was living in. It was too quiet. It's basically farm country, and I wanted to move to the Bay Area and see what the real startup scene was like. And so I got a job with a startup as an account manager because I had also decided that I didn't like nonstop computer work, that I wanted to be on the front lines working with some people. I really liked that, either the experience of working with customers or the experience of having some back and forth. And it took maybe a year and a half for that startup to go through its kind of life cycle and have trouble. But during that period of time before I got laid off, I also ended up doing training. It was a small startup. And so I got a little taste of different things, and that was fun. When it came time to look for a job, it was actually the dot-com bust. Again, to date me, this was like 2001. Many of you weren't alive, I know. But just to go back to when you were either very small or not alive, this was 2000, 2001, and a lot of the Bay Area, there was an initial dot-com bust when all of these startups closed. And you would go around to the cafes and everyone was just sitting around because no one had jobs. That was kind of the feel of it. And that's when I got laid off. And I, just started to apply for things. I didn't really know what I wanted to get into. And I ended up applying for an account management role again at Google, really a customer management role, kind of front lines. And that's what got me into the Google time. Do you want me to go through the Google stuff maybe briefly also?
Yeah, sure.
It was a really long answer, so just checking. Yeah, I mean, I've had 4 different main jobs in that time in Google, and the first one was kind of organic. I came in to do frontline customer support for AdWords, our ads product, reviewing and approving ads and answering customer email. And shortly after I did that, we really started to grow. And I took on this job around policy, what ads we accept and what we don't accept. It was pretty informal. I just started doing it with part of my time, making sure we had policies documented and helping answer questions of newbies on what the policy issues were. That all turned into a full-time job. And ultimately the first 10 years at Google, because I ended up over time moving into people management, over time taking on more responsibility. And I ended up owning a team responsible for implementing, maintaining, and even creating new policies for ads and other products as our product suite grew at Google. And really great experience, although a lot of it was me just like learning as I went along. There wasn't a guidebook to how to do this stuff. A lot of it was happening for the first time on the internet. And I also was figuring out how to be a people manager and later a director as I went along. At the 10-year mark, I decided to make a big change and move over to Google Fiber. That's our ultra fast broadband product. And it was just starting out. So back to startup mode. And I built out a customer support and installs team. Super fun, different again, although had skills I could pull from my previous role. I always like to joke it's the first time I knew what I was doing in my career because I actually had experience and was going in and could reuse it. And then that went through a startup arc. And about 5 years later, the company overall decided to make the team working on it much smaller. It was still going to keep the product, but it was going to repurpose a lot of the people to other teams within Google. And so I spent that particular year, it was 2017, building out processes and resources to help those people find their next jobs. And then I found my next job, which was the one that I talked about, the infrastructure job. So I don't think like most careers, I don't think you could have predicted a lot of that. But it was a lot of seeing what I liked and figuring out what were the translatable skills. So I'm going to walk with you for a second because my dog and cat are too quiet.
Okay. Could you tell us a little bit more about what your book is about?
Okay, they're fine. We're fostering a kitten for context, and my dog is so excited. The cat is okay. The cat's okay. My book is about something that I was just sort of annoyed about, which was that I was looking around and I saw all of these women that I was working with who were leading interesting, fulfilling, multi-year, multi-decade careers in tech. But when I looked around, I wasn't seeing those stories necessarily. At the time that I was thinking about this book, it was early 2019, kind of late 2018, early 2019. And a lot of what was going on was the sharing of bad stories, which I was glad that those were being shared. Like tech should acknowledge the bad stories of where women aren't being well treated or other minoritized populations aren't being well treated and figure out what to do. But what was springing up after those articles was a lot of like headlines like, do women belong in tech? Can women thrive in tech? And that was the part where I was like I didn't like the chilling effect of what that might be because we weren't also sharing a lot of stories about how women were thriving or how they did navigate. It was just kind of the dark side and skepticism about women in tech. And I was kind of like, who's writing these articles? Certainly not the people like me who are in tech and doing just fine. So I wanted to balance that out. I was thinking about that. At the same time, I was in a place in my career where it really interested me to spend time on something I hadn't gotten a chance to do in a while, something like writing, which I'd loved in school. And started to write an article series on LinkedIn that's about if you want more detail about kind of my growth journey from individual contributor to manager to director and what I had to learn along the way. I have an article series on LinkedIn that walks through that and includes performance feedback I'd received over the years. So it gets really nitty gritty. It says all the things I was bad at. And seeing the reaction to those and people really liking seeing some of like the real stories about how I got through the bad times and what I learned from them and all of that stuff. That really is what the book ended up being, was me trying to both share stories for me and 80 other women I interviewed who were making their way through tech, had different backgrounds, different ambitions, different interests, different roles, because I also didn't want it just to be one story. I wanted it to be lots of different stories so people saw all the different types of roles and backgrounds, et cetera, you could have and thrive in tech and show how they navigated things along the way. So, yes, you're barking. I hear that. And so that was basically what the story that was my idea for the book, and it's actually what ended up, if you buy it today, the book has 3 parts. The first part is basically we come from everywhere, and you hear all about the different backgrounds, the different ambitions, the different ways people think about themselves, and then you get to the middle section, which is, okay, what challenges did we face and how did we navigate them? And then the last section is very focused on what tools or people or whatnot helped along the way. And I kind of also delve into like, are people leaving or are they staying, and kind of what's keeping them or what's making them go. So that's the book in a nutshell.
It sounds really good, and I love how you've covered like lots of different aspects rather than just like the doom and gloom of like the negative stories. It's like highlighting positive stories, which isn't talked about enough. And I'm really glad that you did that. But delving into the second part, what sort of challenges have you faced, or if you want to use an anonymous anecdote from any other research you did during your book, we'd be really interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, you'll if you pick up the book, you'll see different things that the women ran into. some very typical of what you hear. You'll hear the stories about being in a meeting and some man re-explaining something that you just said, or you find out that you're paid less than colleagues, right? Like some of that stuff that I think that you've heard about. But what I liked about the book is that we sort of delved into some of the other things that we can run into as well, that I've had too. Like, for example, me personally, because I've had this career which has been very um, organic, I guess, and I found my niche being this kind of fixer of tough operational and people problems. And it's been a very successful career in many ways. However, it's not definable. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a career product manager. I'm not a salesperson. I'm not a finance person, right? I'm this other thing. And many women actually sort of have found that to be true for themselves, that their career grew organically and they followed their interests and the opportunities. But that being less definable thing has sometimes presented issues for them where they feel like they have to keep re-explaining themselves, or they have to pitch themselves for promotion or opportunities more than people recognize that, you know, they just have talent and you should see it. And I will say that some of that could be true across genders. But I think because women are often the caretakers of society, that's just, gender based how we're raised, right? Um, in general, these are generalizations. Often I find that women end up in that boat a little bit more because they've been going where the need is and where the organizations need them, and often not watching out like for themselves or their career. And then they'll find out later that, oh, all this work that I've been doing, you like, but you don't value, right? You like that I'm doing this stuff. You thank me all the time for it. But when it comes to promotion time, it's these other people who are just launching things that you recognize. So I do think that was something I've seen and had to figure out both what's important to me, right? Do I want one of these jobs that's more definable because I want a more linear career projection? But also how to explain myself more and how to have people understand and contextualize what I do. And it's something that I still work on in my career. There were other things that I think that we just generally run into society, how women's voices are heard in the room, whether women help other women. If you do speak up, are you viewed to be less likable? Because one of the catch 22s of the career workplace is that we're supposed to do all of this, but somehow remain likable because women are expected to be more likable. I won't tell you the dynamic between the dog and the cat, but often the dog is saying, play me, play with me. And the cat is like under a chair. So apologies if I'm actually in this room, which is not my usual setup, so I can monitor what's going on. They were too excited to be with each other to rip them apart in the minutes before this started. So we'll see. Anyway, that's the nutshell of that answer, is lots of different things. And then there is a part of the middle section where I also talk about, well, then how do you have a life? How do you, whether you want kids or not, like how do you balance or not balance or choose or not choose some things, because tech can be such a high paced life if you choose it. So lots of different little nuggets that I think are really interesting, and you may find different levels at it depending on where you go.
Thank you so much for the detail you went into and like being willing to, share the kind of challenging side. I think it's really interesting. Could you talk a bit about some of the specific ways you've advocated for change around women in STEM, and kind of about the successes, maybe a bit about the challenges, but anything you feel is relevant to that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because over the course of, and I talk about this a bit in the book, but over the course of my career in tech, it took me a while to even first recognize what could be better. When I started in tech, it was very much already a environment that was focused on meritocracy and in the purest sense, right? Like, we're not going to reward you because you're someone's friend or reward you because you're someone's brother or whatever it is. It's based on the work. And we are going to calculate your bonus based on your work. We're going to do all of these things based on your work. And that's how we're going to have a level playing field. And so those early years, I was actually, because I was working so hard, rewarded quite a bit. And so were female colleagues that I worked with. So it was, I didn't come in and right away see a problem. And it actually took me years to start to see why, for instance, it would even be good to join like the woman employee resource group and have a sense of that. I was just so busy and learning so fast, and I didn't have time for any events anyway, and everything seemed to be going fine. There were two reasons for that. One was that I was actually in a sales environment which was more women dominated, and in fact, many of the leaders were women. And so I was seeing women in the room who were leaders, who had voices, and I was learning from them. It was already a more balanced environment. But the second piece is that this is often more differentiated when you start to see what happens later in people's career. When you get to mid-career and you start to see how many people are promoted, how many leaders in the room are men. And so you start to see some differences as you get more senior that I wasn't seeing as I was junior. When at the 10-year mark, I moved over to Google Fiber, which was not a sales organization, but an engineering organization. It was the first time in my career where I was repeatedly in rooms where I was the only female. And I saw that dynamic that I was hearing other people talk about. And at the same time, around those same years, we started to talk a lot more about unconscious bias. It was the first time organically, kind of what had happened was that more and more people were seeing the differences and starting to study the differences and talk about the differences. So it was the first time in my career at Google where I was getting trained on unconscious bias, and I was hearing other people's stories about where they were assumed certain things. It was really the first time where we said, hey, the meritocracy doesn't totally work, because the whole problem is that we've got all this coding. We've got all this coding that is playing out even unconsciously, silently, that makes us view people's work differently, or makes us assume certain backgrounds are better than other ones, or makes us assume certain people have characteristics, or makes us look at those characteristics and call one assertive and one aggressive, right? And so that was the first time in my career, and I was like, oh, I mean, literally 10 years in, and I was like, oh, it was them, right? Like, because most of the time I had just been growing and so junior that most of the time I had been like, oh, it's me. I need to get better at this. I need to adapt how I'm talking. If they didn't hear me in the room, it's because I didn't speak up well enough. And so it was the first time in my career, sort of at the 10-year, 11-year mark, I was a director, but I was also learning these things that I both felt like I had a voice and a language to bring them up. So a really long intro just to say that then over the years since then, I felt like I've been able to speak up much more, partially because I have the clout, but not just that. It's because the world has given me a way to bring this up and say, hey, what happened in that meeting wasn't on that person, it was on you. Or what happened in that meeting could have been better if we'd voiced up, or even have me voice up and say, hey, we have to stop interrupting this person. And also with last year's conversations about structural injustice, all of these things give me frameworks to say, hey, have you noticed how our promotion process does this? have you noticed how when we hire people, we always ask these questions, and are those questions fair? So I have felt like a lot of what I've been able to do over the years is not just advocate for people in the moment, but also start to question the systems and push on changing the systems. But it was really helped quite a lot by, to some degree, the world of evolving around me and starting to talk about these things that we weren't talking about 20, 30, 40 years ago.
You probably have a really good network of women in STEM around you to just share knowledge and remind you that you're not alone. So, how do you go about creating that network?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that I wouldn't have necessarily said that I had it in the early years. I was working so hard and um just really trying to like hold on to the ladder. I wasn't necessarily like looking around and trying to figure out how I was going to go up the ladder or who else was on the ladder or how we could support each other. Some of it did happen organically, luckily enough, but I wasn't really mindful about it. And I do think that it helps to be mindful about it. And it doesn't have to just be women. In general, who is your support network? Who do you go to when you had that tough meeting? And you can say, hey, this is what happened. And was it me? Was it them? What should I try next time? What's going on? When you get performance feedback and you're wondering whether to take it seems off, you don't know what to do with it. Who do you go to that helps you think through it and say, well, actually, you could work on this? Or, oh, that's weird. I don't know why you got that feedback. Maybe you should ask your manager X, Y, and Z. And that could be men, it could be women. It's just about having the support. It's genderless, if you will. And some people talk about building their personal board, and that can be an idea you carry with you. Who are your 5 or 6 people? Maybe you go to them for different things because they're good for different things. But what I would say is the main advice that I would give is watch out for those people who impress you. Watch out for those people who are great listeners, who you have great conversations with. And don't feel like you just have to like marry one mentor for your career. Feel like you can have these conversations where you say to them, hey, I have 3 questions. Do you have 30 minutes where we can just talk over coffee or over VC, whatever it is? And I just want to pick your brain because you're really good at this. And quit it. And that's all it takes sometimes to forge that connection. And then you can go back to them later and say, hey, it evolved and I have these questions, etc. And maybe that evolves into a friendship over time. Maybe it's just a relationship where you can reach out when you need to. And I think that's what I had to learn over the years, because I think I just felt like it was such a huge imposition on people's time. And who was I to talk to them? The them always seemed more senior, smarter, better than me. And I had to figure out over time that number one, people love to talk about themselves. They love to seem like experts. They're going to be perfectly happy to talk with you. But what you need to do is respect their time and come in and very linearly say, I've thought about it. I have these questions about it, and I'd like to take up this much time and talk to you about it. I would say, by the way, that sometimes this is the entrance to those people becoming long-term mentors or becoming long-term sponsors. But just feel like you can start small and you can start with those conversations and build that group for yourselves that are there for you. Now, I will just add, sometimes there are great groups that you may be part of. This group that you could continue to have, an alumni group that you could continue to have, an online group that you find of women in tech. All of that's great too. But I do think it's nice to have at least some people who know you a bit better, who you go to throughout the years.
Thank you. Your tips for like networking are really useful, especially for like an organization that does have a lot of youth and we're like kind of getting into the where we maybe might start networking. So thank you for that. Kind of similar to that, do you have any steps and tips for those looking to build their own tech related businesses or start building their way into like the tech world?
I generally say, first off, the tech has grown quite large and there's a ton of things. I mean, it's kind of an obvious statement, but like, do you like hardware? Do you like software? Do you like phones? Do you like more practical applications of things? Are you more interested in how the healthcare industry is applying things, how biotech is? Are you interested in AI? Right? Like, there's all these different paths you could go. And so, what I generally say is follow your interests, read, explore, see what you're attracted to, and experiment with that, whether it's that you initially get a job with a company and see what that's like, whether you get a job with a startup and you see what that's like, whether you start your own side business and you see what that's like. But you don't think of anything as the be all end all because careers are very long. At this point, we work 50 years, give or take. Maybe some of us retire earlier, maybe later, maybe we never retire, but it's long. And I think sometimes in the moment we think this first job that we get is everything. And I don't know, I was only at mine for like a year. So it matters, but it's also not everything, right? So I think following those interests and exploring and whatnot, very good. Now, I will say doing your own thing is really hard. Everyone will tell you that. And so I think that if you are thinking about starting your own thing or exploring your own business, I think figuring out ways that you can test it and have sort of safe to fail moments before you go all in, before you spend all your money, before you move halfway across the world and then get stuck somewhere. But like, what are the little ways that you can take your idea and gauge interest in it and figure out how to market it, whether does it have legs, basically, before you go all in? And there's so many more than there used to be now. Online forums for this, incubators, way to test and get assess interest, and people who advise developers and startups and whatnot. So definitely explore and do your research if you're going down that path. And I guess the last thing I would say is if you don't want to do your own thing quite yet, but you're interested in maybe doing it one day, think about that in terms of what kind of jobs you're exploring, right? If you want to maybe create your own product one day, how can you get exposure in your early jobs to what it's like to build and create a product? And for you, that might mean, okay, let me go to this startup and live see how they do it. Or it might mean, oh, I'd like to intern at a Google or insert Amazon, Facebook, wherever to see how they do it. It may mean different things to different people, but think through what that looks like that you can get a sense of what's needed. What does it look like? How hard is it? How do you do X, Y, or Z? And that's a good way to build your own, I don't know, almost education program, right? If there's no MBA that will teach you this exactly, how do you build your own way of teaching yourself before you go down that path?
What changes have you seen in the past few years that affect the field of technology, and what do you predict will happen in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think there's two main things I've seen. I think number one is the rise of machine learning and AI, and obviously a huge technical leap, but also a real ethical conundrum of how it will be used and bigger questions there about where it if you basically taught machines how society works and society has all these biases, Like, what are you going to do to unteach the system them or improve the system to really reflect what's more real? And so I think that that's an interesting space. It's not one that I'm attracted to personally, but it's really meaty, either because of the development that's happening there from a technological perspective, or the way it gets applied to real life human situations. Very meaty, very interesting. I think that could be a real um, chewy area, really meaty is the word I'm looking for, area to get into in the future. Secondly, what I'm seeing is sort of the reckoning of what happened during COVID and the fact that technology had been focusing so much on the, I don't know what I would call, but like sort of the glitzy, fun pieces of tech, and not enough to support our core systems, healthcare, education, you name it. And there's also those questions emerging from an environmental perspective, and other kind of key societal questions that are coming up. And so I do think there is a question on what does the next 10 years look like on tech? And has some of what we've seen in COVID spur people to see the ways tech can really rise and help in those situations, or the gaps? Quit it. I would love to see more there. I think the problem is that sometimes the line to money making is less clear. And I think that place is emerging and interesting, but it will take even more sort of exploration and innovation to sustain it and make it interesting for investors and money making, even though it's what's really needed. And so it'll be interesting to me whether like everyone just goes back to making new phones in the next year, or whether some of this sticks and we see more investment and concerns about it going forward, given society's issues overall. I really like it because to me, what got me into tech is more of that kind of stuff than apps and games and whatnot. But either way, there'll always be a lucrative area. whatever you want to get into, there'll always be that stuff will always be there too. I'm just interested to see what might come next with some of the things that really get at the root of society's issues.
Thank you so much for that, and kind of giving like a balanced view of like, here's one side of it. I really like the way it's really useful for us to have kind of two sides of everything so that we can like get a broad view rather than just the kind of obvious. So thank you for that. Delving into kind of artificial intelligence, what effect has that made on the technology field in kind of where you work, or just generally, or any differences you've kind of just like noticed that you're like, oh, that's new?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing I've noticed is everyone's still sorting out what it's for and what it means. People like to throw out MLAI just everywhere. Whenever they run into an issue that they feel like might be untenable or undoable, they're like, oh, maybe MLAI will help here. Maybe getting the machines to work on this. So what I would say is that we're still sorting out where it's most useful and where it's most effective, and where it is sustainable. It also is a lot more work than people think. Like they sort of think like, oh, let's, like we'll get the AI on it and then the humans won't have to work anymore. No. You spend years training the models on this stuff so that the computers can then do what needs to be done and start to pick up things on their own in terms of patterns that maybe you didn't already know, or I'm trying to think of like a real life case, but you'll hear these examples of where we've been able to apply it to the medical field and notice things that X-ray technicians, for example, can't see on their own or as quickly. And that's all lovely. And it takes years to do of people behind the scenes bit by bit training it to see those things. So I think, we're sort of in the stage where everyone's skeptical and scared of it and all of that. And I think that that's good, just to always be a bit skeptical and scared. But I will also say that behind the scenes, I can see that it's moving much, much slower, and people are being quite thoughtful and deliberate of its applications, not just because of those societal implications, but also because it takes years and it's really expensive to do upfront. Later on, it can become amazing, but upfront, you put a lot of investment into making that happen, and it won't always work for every situation. But a lot of people will talk about it. So if you get into MLAI, just be prepared to have a lot of, it's like a research field. Be prepared to have a lot of failures, not just all the glitzy successes.
It was really insightful because a lot of people talk about ML and AI as being the new big thing. So, what personal qualities and skills do you feel are needed to succeed in the technology field?
I think there's an overemphasis on technical skill. I certainly think that having a background in coding or in other adjacent technical fields is useful. And by the way, often gets you because it is still, quit it, valued in the market. It often gets you higher pay. So I am not going to underrate those skills. They are lovely. However, what I've seen more and more is that they are not actually what makes someone successful for the most part. What tends to make someone successful are the things that we underrate as soft skills. How do you convince people of your ideas? How do you negotiate? How do you deal with conflict? How do you motivate people to work with you or work on something with you? All of those things are really sometimes the secret sauce and the underrated sauce of what happens. And like I explained earlier, my job is way more with people than machines. And so if I'm not good at those people skills, I'm not going to be as successful. And there is a lot of just unseen, it's hard to sometimes look at someone and explain, like, how did that work? Like, how did they achieve that? And often it's these things. It's like, oh, if you look at why Sundar is CEO of Google, for example, why did he get chosen by Larry to succeed him? It was, yes, he has a technical mind. He has technical ideas. He has technical background. That was a component of it. But he was also extremely well liked. He was able to navigate the company and get things done and be respected. He had led teams that respected him and had flourished. There were all of these things that I think sometimes get underrated that really makes or breaks a good engineer versus the guy that gets to lead the team. A great sales person versus the woman that gets to get the bigger clientele, right? There's all of this unseen things. And I think really paying attention to not just what you do, but how you do it and how you do it well will be key in your careers.
Thank you so much. We're on to our final question, which is kind of looking back at your high school days, what final advice would you give students interested in technology and what opportunities should they look for or actively seek out?
Well, my high school days were so long ago, everyone. When you embark, it's really going to vary by where you are. And I know you are all sort of in global places. And so that move from high school to university may look different for many of you. But I do think it's worth just questioning, in a nice way, maybe everything that you've been taught, which is pretty bold. But I don't mean everything. What I mean is some of the silent things that you get taught that maybe no one even talks about. That maybe, for instance, you've been successful to date by working really hard and keeping your head down and not having to argue or advocate, but more just working hard and doing it. Maybe you've been successful because you were always the person that helped out, volunteered in some group or another. And that has also been something that has helped you be successful in school. Maybe your parents have even placed limitations on you. There are only certain careers that are successful. Maybe you've just absorbed that from your parents or from people around you, that certain paths are successful and others aren't. And what I would just say is all of that's like coding. All of that's just like the silent little code that we accept, and it influences us all through our lives about whether we feel good or we feel bad, or we think that we should travel somewhere and take a job, or we feel like we're letting people down if we stop doing something. All of that is silently influencing us. And the earlier you can question it, I think the better, because this is the time where it starts to be about you and what you really want to do, what you really like to do, and what makes you happy and makes you feel fulfilled. And I see plenty of women in their 40s, 30s, and 40s still grappling with the fact that there is one definition of success, which is climbing the ladder. And it doesn't match with actually what makes them happy. And that conflict of like, society won't view me as successful, even though I don't even want that job, is still something they're battling with late in their career. So what I would just say is question it earlier, and know that some of the things that got you here won't get you there. And I'll close with the example that I always give people, which is that it took me years to learn to ask for what I need, ask for what I want, because I'd been so successful just putting my head down and getting things done. And I got into my career and didn't realize, oh, you're going to have to tell people that you're interested in that other job. You're going to have to tell people that potentially you want that raise, or you're going to ask for help because they're not going to know that all those 10 groups are asking for something because you're the only one who knows. And it took me years. And so I'm just trying to tell everyone earlier than me, just know you should ask for what you want, ask for what you need. It will be better for you. It's in the book too, if you ever need reinforcement on that topic. Huge. It was true across the 80 women. It was something that I wrote about as a key tool that women need.
Thank you so much. We're out of time now as it's coming up to the hour. Once again, thank you for joining us. And it was really great to have your like actually meaningful advice and stories that's going to help a lot of people on here and help Rev STEM kind of promote the message of getting women in STEM careers. So thank you for joining us.
Okay, I just put a little message on. I could put in my LinkedIn too, but you can follow or connect with me. I'm always happy if you didn't get a chance to answer questions, to ask me there. And I'll also put in my website just in case you want to reach out to me there, you're interested in more of my background or the book.
Thank you for all of that. I'll pass that on to some of our team members as well in case they didn't get a chance to, ask any questions. I think there's some messages coming in the chat as well.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go see how the cat and the dog are. Bye.